In this lecture, we're going to begin the process of looking at anatomy and physiology. We're going to look at how it's organized. We're going to look at some various types of anatomy. So there are different types of anatomy based on what your emphasis is or what you're really focusing on. In this lecture, we'll also look at kind of some general classification of tissues and cells, and then we'll have later lectures that are more specific to those topics. So this lecture is really just going to be a broad overview of anatomy and physiology, what those are, body systems, anatomical regions, and other similar things. All right. So when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about generally in a class like this, we're talking about both anatomy and physiology, right? So anatomy and physiology are separate, right? They're separate disciplines, but they are related to one another, right? So anatomy is going to be the structure of our body, the structure of different organs or different things in our body, whereas physiology is going to be the functionality of that structure, right? So we may talk about anatomy, we may talk about the anatomy of the GI tract. So we're looking at the structure of it, what is it made of, and then the physiology of that is going to be, okay, what does it do, or how does it accomplish its function, all right? And a really important relationship between anatomy and physiology is that the anatomy is going to dictate the physiology, or in other words, the structure of something is going to determine or dictate how that structure functions or what it does, right? And we'll see that all throughout this course in A&P1. You'll see it all throughout A&P2 as well, and we'll look at some examples here. All right. So one really good example is our mitochondria, right? So you probably remember from middle school science or high school biology that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? And really, that's always true. You just add more meaning behind what is the powerhouse of the cell. What does that mean, right? And so for our mitochondria, when you look at it, if you were to take a section of it, kind of a cross section, you'd see that it has two different membranes. Okay, it has an outer membrane that you can see kind of here in this pink color, and then it has this inner membrane, which is this one here in yellow. And what the mitochondria does is it helps to produce our ATP, right? So our energy currency in the cell, right? Where this really occurs is that it occurs on this membrane, on this inner membrane here. There are different proteins that reside on this membrane that help to produce that ATP. Well, if you have more surface area and you have more folds of these inner membranes, you have more area to store these proteins, and so you have a greater ability to carry out cellular respiration to produce more ATP, right? So this anatomy of the mitochondria, this structure, all of these inner folds, and these inner folds are called cristae or crista if you're talking about one. So this anatomy, these inner folds, the anatomy determines the mitochondria's physiology. It determines what it does, which is produce lots and lots of ATP. So because of its anatomy, it can have a high ability to produce lots of ATP, so it has a very specific physiology. Okay, we'll see this all throughout anatomy. And once you begin to look at structures or organs, and then you associate a function with that organ, you begin to see how that function matches up very nicely with its anatomy, okay, with its structure, all right? So when we look at anatomy, we're looking at the form, the structure of the body. So if we look at something like the kidney, all right, so here on the left, we're looking at the kidney. In A&P2, you'll talk about the renal system, you'll talk about urinary system. In the kidney, there are lots and lots of these things called pyramids, right? They're in a region called the medulla of the kidney. But that's just describing the structure, right? It's describing the anatomy. What does it look like? If you were to pull the kidney out of the body, cut it open, and look at it, what would it look like? That's what we're talking about here, all right? Mitochondria are more numerous than muscle cells. Again, that's describing an anatomical quality of muscle cells. The triceps has 3 heads, so the term tri means 3. Ceps or cephalic refers to head, so the triceps on the back of our arm refers to the 3-headed muscle on the arm, right? All of these are describing the structure of something. They're describing the structure of something in the body, all right? For physiology, physiology, we said, is going to be the functionality. So what does the triceps do? Well, the triceps is involved in extension of the arm at the elbow, right? What does the mitochondria do? The mitochondria is it requires glucose in order to produce ATP, right? What does the GI tract do? Well, it is involved in absorption of ingested material. It can secrete gastric juices and gastric acid, all these different things, right? So we're describing what it does. What is its function? Okay, so if we look at another example here in the lung, so our lung we know is the site of gas exchange between our external environment and our internal environment, so our blood, right? And this is specifically referred to as external ventilation, and you'll talk about this in AMP2. However, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the kind of functional unit of the lung, which is called an alveolus, okay, or alveoli if you're talking about plural, right? So this sac here that you see on the right, this is an alveolus, right? Air will come into the alveolus, it will diffuse across the membrane into the blood, and the blood will then take that oxygenated blood to the tissues, and then likewise carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the blood into the alveolus, and then we exhale that, right? So you may begin to think that in order for this gas to diffuse across a cell or across this membrane, that membrane probably needs to be relatively thin, right? It needs to be relatively small to decrease the amount of surface area that gas has to diffuse through, and that's exactly what we see, right? So our alveolus, and we'll talk about this in a few lectures from now, is a simple squamous epithelium, meaning it is a single layer of very small, flat cells. Okay, so squamous is referring to something that is very flat and kind of stretched out. Okay, so that's the anatomy of the alveolus, right? That's the anatomy, that's its structure. Because of that anatomy, because it's very flat, very thin, not very thick, its physiology is conducive to allowing that air, that oxygen and that carbon dioxide to go right across the membrane into the blood if it's oxygen, or out of the blood if it's carbon dioxide, right? So again, we see a very good relationship of anatomy dictating physiology, the structure of something dictating how that thing functions, okay? So when we look at anatomy specifically, all right, so we're just looking at the structure of the body, okay? We can do so in a couple of different ways, okay? One of them is gross anatomy, okay? So gross anatomy just kind of being a broad scale. We're looking at things kind of from a external view, what we can generally see with the unaided eye. Okay, so we may look at an entire organ, or we may look at things that are dissected or prosected already. Like so, in lab in AMP 1 and 2, we'll do a couple of different dissections. We'll look at brain, we may look at a heart, we may look at a kidney, an eye, some different things. Okay, so we can take this gross anatomy, or macroscopic, in contrast with microscopic, right? And we can look at some different subcategories, okay, or divisions. So the first division is a systemic anatomy, okay, or a systemic anatomy course, all right? So our course, this course that you're currently enrolled in, is a systemic anatomy course, meaning that we look at the individual body systems, that's where we get the term systemic, and we approach the course by learning each individual system, right? So we'll look at the integumentary system, right? And then we'll look at the muscular system, and then we'll look at the skeletal, and the nervous, and the endocrine, and so on and so forth, right? And so it is just a very convenient way to break up learning the body, is to break it up into its individual systems. However, do be aware that although we may study just the integumentary system, and then just the skeletal system, and just the muscular, and so on, those systems in the body do not function in isolation, right? They don't exist in isolation. They're all working together in one way or another. But just know that it's convenient from an academic standpoint to break it up into the individual systems, whereas in the actual body, in your body right now, all of those things are working together, okay? So the second type is regional anatomy, okay? So a regional anatomy, and a lot of these different subtypes of anatomy, and really a lot of anatomical terms in general, you can kind of deduce what they mean just based on their name. Okay, that's a really good thing about anatomy. Okay, it's usually very descriptive, right? So regional anatomy, we're looking at the individual body regions, and then we're looking at all of the structures in those regions, right? So when I was doing my graduate work, I took a gross anatomy course, which involved human cadaveric dissection, right? So the dissection of the human cadaver, so a dead body. And the way you approach that is you approach it in a regional anatomy context, right? So we started with the thorax, abdomen, pelvis, and perineum. We dissected that, looked at all of the structures, found all the structures in that region. We then went on to the back and the limbs, right? So we flipped our cadaver over, we dissected the back, found the muscles, found the nerves, whatnot, went on to the arms and legs, did the same thing. And then we finished with the head and neck, right? You dissect the head, the face, the neck, and you find all of the structures in that area, okay? So in that context, you're primarily focusing on anatomy, right? You're going to go to a region, you're going to go to the head, you're going to dissect the head, and you're going to find the anatomy, find the structures in that region, right? In our class, we're going to do both anatomy, we're going to look at anatomy, and then we're also going to look at how that anatomy functions, right? So we're also going to look at the physiology, all right? The third type here is surface anatomy. So surface anatomy, based on its name, you can probably figure out, is looking and identifying different anatomical structures and whatnot based on superficial landmarks, right? So when you look at somebody, you can see bones kind of through the skin. You may be able to see tendons. You can certainly see musculature if somebody's very fit and they have very good muscle tone, right? So all of these things are surface anatomy features, right? You can see them from the surface. You don't have to dissect. You don't have to go inside the body. You can see them from a very superficial view, right? So a really good example I always tell students is if you hold out your right arm with your arm straight and your palm up, and you go towards your elbow region and you feel on the medial side. So we'll talk about medial meaning closest to the midline of your body. So in this case, on the inside of your elbow, you should feel a very large, and even see a very large bony protuberance, a very large bony landmark there. All right, that is called your medial epicondyle, and it's a very good and easy to find surface anatomy landmark, right? If you go just behind that medial epicondyle and you push really hard, you may get a nice sensation running down your arm and into your fingers. That's your funny bone, right? So whenever you hit your elbow and you say, I hit my funny bone, that's this nerve that you're hitting called the ulnar nerve, and that's why you feel it radiating down your forearm and into your hand and fingers, right? But that medial epicondyle is a very good surface landmark, right? And then lastly is comparative anatomy. And again, comparative, you can probably figure out what it's focusing on. We're looking at the anatomy as we can compare it between one animal and another animal, or one species and another species. So you may compare the anatomy of a shark to an anatomy of a lizard to an anatomy of an ape to an anatomy of a modern human, or something like that, right? And you'll see, and we'll see this too whenever we do different dissections, that a lot of our anatomy is very similar, right? So when we look at the anatomy of a chimpanzee and the anatomy of a modern human, they're very, very similar, right? We could also look at different anatomical features of different species that are quite different, right? We can also track the changes in anatomy in one species, or as one species kind of progresses and transforms into other species, we can track these changes over time, right? All right, so those were all macroscopic, right? So gross anatomy, large scale, right? So obviously the opposite of that is going to be microscopic. So whereas macroscopic or gross anatomy you can view with the unaided eye, right? You can just see it. Microscopic you can't. So generally you have to use a microscope. So for microscopic, we're going to have two different divisions. One of these is going to be cytology, and one of these is going to be histology, right? Cyto, the prefix cyto means cell, right? So cytology, and remember, anytime you see the term ology or logy, that's referring to study. So this is the study of cells, right? So study of cells and how they are composed, where they're located. And then histology, the prefix histo means tissue, right? So histology is the study of tissues, and we'll have a whole separate, we'll look at some tissues in this lecture, but we'll have a whole separate lecture specifically on histology. And then in lab, you'll learn how to identify and recognize histological tissues based on their appearance and their different characteristics, right? But the big idea here is that we have to use a microscope. We are unable to see these things with the unaided eye, okay? Now, there are also different types of imaging that can help us with our anatomy, right, or help us with our um, uh, gross anatomy. Um, so some of these are very common. You may be familiar with them. Some of them maybe not so much. So the first one is radiography, right? Radiography is essentially an X-ray, right? So we can use high energy radiation. We can take a picture. When you're looking at a radiograph or when you're looking at an X-ray, whatever tissue, and this is specifically for dense tissue, so for hard tissue, so for bone specifically, right? Um, this is not for muscles. This is not for um, uh, tendons and ligaments and muscles and whatnot. This is specifically for bone. Okay. When you're looking at a radiograph or an X-ray, if the tissue appears very white, very bright white, that indicates to you that that tissue is very dense. Okay, so when you look at this image up on the left here, and we'll look at different X-rays throughout the semester, when you see it very white, so you can kind of see down here at the base of the skull, along the occipital bone, maybe parts of the temporal bone here as well, it looks very white. It looks very bright white. That means that area of the bone is very thick and it's very dense. Okay, other areas where it's a little bit less white, kind of maybe more on the gray scale, that's just going to mean it's a little bit less dense, a little bit less thick. Okay. The second one is a computed tomography scan or a CT scan, right? So this is similar to an X-ray, but it's as though you took lots and lots of X-rays into very thin slices, and then you merge them together into a nice three-dimensional image. And so you can kind of scroll through a CT image and see varying levels of the body in order to identify tumors or to identify various types of abnormalities, right? One important thing to know about a CT scan, and this will help you in lab as well, when you're looking at a CT scan, it's always as if you're looking up toward the patient's head from the feet, right? So in this image here we're looking at a CT scan. Imagine you're standing down below the patient where their feet would be, and you're looking up toward them, right? So this would be the underside of the skull. Here's their eyes. This side over here, we'll talk about it. This would be their left side, even though this is our right. This would be their right side, even though this is our left, right? So we'll talk about a lot, and we'll really emphasize anatomical left and anatomical right and what that means for identifying different structures. Okay. The next one is an MRI, right? So an MRI is a magnetic resonance imaging. This is using a large magnet to visualize soft tissue. So this is better for looking at maybe some brain tissue. You could also use this for looking at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And you can see hard tissue structures, right? So you can see the skull, right? You can see the bony skull, but you can really see and visualize soft tissue as well. All right. There's sonography as well, right? So we're probably all relatively familiar with sonography from like ultrasounds during pregnancies, right? So we're using high frequency sound waves, ultrasound waves, to then produce a picture. And so this can be used from an orthopedic standpoint for maybe some soft tissue or rotator cuff tear. So this is a group of muscles we'll talk about. And then obviously, like we just said, it's most common, or we most commonly associate it with pregnancy and getting an ultrasound, getting a picture of the fetus, right? So here you can see a nice picture right here. And then lastly, we have a positron emission tomography scan. This is what's referred to as a PET scan. This PET scan is looking at the metabolic activity. So in other words, how metabolically active is a particular tissue, and this is really helpful for identifying tumors and cancers, right? So tumors and cancers are a rapid division and a rapid multiplication of our own body cells, and they're highly metabolically active, right? And so they take up lots of glucose, they take up lots of resources, and this is one of the reasons why they're so damaging to our bodies, right? And so what can happen here is you can attach a sugar molecule, so a glucose molecule, onto a tracer, and then this will emit these things called positrons, all right? Whenever you take the picture during a PET scan, this tracer with this glucose attached to it will find its way and be taken up by tissues in the body that are highly metabolically active, right? And so in this case of here that we're looking at, this looks like an image of a brain here in red. You see this area has taken up that tracer with the glucose, and it is highly metabolically active. So this image here, this likely indicates that this is some type of lesion, potentially some type of cancerous tumor that we see in the brain. Okay. All right. So answer this question. The following is an example of a structure-function relationship. You can pause the video. I'm going to go ahead and answer, but you pause the video, think about it, and then keep playing, all right? So the following is an example of a structure-function relationship. The answer here is going to be B, right? So the thin, flat surface of an alveolus increases surface area for gas exchange. This is the example that we gave earlier. These other ones do not have to do with a structure-function relationship. They may just have to do with basic anatomy, basic structure. This has to do with imaging, electron transport chain is used to form ATP. That's more of just a description of how cellular respiration works, but not necessarily a structure and function relationship, right? So the best answer in this case would be B, all right? So we're going to stop here, and then we will pick up talking about biomolecules in part 2 of the lecture.